Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to Gender and Society. This is lecture number 6, where we will be discussing theories of feminism. So in the past few lectures since the start of the course, you have seen that we have been talking about the evolving nature of gender. The gender as a concept has evolved over time, and particularly in the last couple of lectures you have seen that we have talked about the broad historical contexts, the broad theoretical premises on which gender is conditioned, on which gender is understood. And particularly the last lecture introduced you to some of the key historical events, key historical moments that encouraged movements, gender movements across the world. And the idea of feminism or feminisms, that there are multiple forms of feminism, emerges with a historical context in that backdrop. And what we will see in this lecture is what are some of the key theoretical frameworks and theories of feminism. And so we will see over time how has the idea of feminism changed, and what brought the initial conceptualization of the idea of feminisms, and how has the ideas changed over time. And in that backdrop, we are also going to look at an understanding between structuralism and post-structuralism. So these are again there are various ways of understanding structuralism, post-structuralism, and we will see how all of that relate to the discussion on feminism. So a starting point to understand where is the ideology or the idea or the framework, however you want to understand it, is positioned. And if you look at the broad theories of gender that scholars have proposed over the decades, you see that there has been a conventional, a traditional understanding of gender, and one of the set of theories guiding those principles has been under the umbrella of feminism. So that has been a very conventional way of understanding some of the important theoretical perspectives related to gender. And a more recently articulated, I would say, field of studies that is emerging and growing now is masculinity studies. So this is the one. This is a very, very broad context in which you can premise, you can put feminism to give it a background. So we see that I'm sure you are familiar with the idea that there has been several waves of feminism. So that it came in the first wave, the second wave, the third wave. So there has been various transformations in the ideology, the idea of feminism. But one of the starting points of looking at feminism is using the critical stance, is to see that it emerged. The initial ideas of the first ideas of feminism emerged as a critique of the mainstream norm. So what was being taken as this norm in any society? How were the boundaries around the norms being drawn? Who were included in that boundary, who were not included in that boundary? So basically, how were the mainstream social norms understood? So one of the starting points in this regard is to understand feminism in that context of critiquing the mainstream norm. The second critical stance here may be adopted to understand that androcentric bias rendering women invisible or marginal. So we see that historically these concepts have been produced or made visible, in other words, using an androcentric bias. And as a result, what happened is the category of women, whether it's treated as a homogeneous category or not, that rendered women invisible or marginal. So we talked about margins a little bit previously, and we will continue talking about the margins later on in the course, in the various lectures. But again, this is another critical stance with respect to feminism, that it brought with it, or it exposed the idea that the presence of an androcentric bias in scholarship or academia or in society, it rendered women invisible or marginal. And the third critical stance in this regard is critiquing an universal understanding of men as universal understanding of humanity. And so again, there was a danger with the androcentric bias also, and it did not exclude men from the discussion, that much of these understandings or much of these conceptualizations carried on with an universal understanding of men being automatically synonymous with an universal understanding of humanity. So the category of human was automatically equated with the category of man, and that became the universal understanding, that became the social norm, that became how the boundaries were actually drawn. Now, there's a danger with this understanding, that is, it kind of homogenized the category of men also, assuming that all men are, they have the same experience, they go through the same events, the same life processes, they take part in the same sort of activities. So in a way, this is the danger that it brought with it, that not only did it render the category of women marginal or invisible, but it at the same time, it also homogenized, it also took it for granted that all men, or the category of men, are homogeneous category, they are uniform, they are universal. So these are some of the critical stance from where the earliest ideas of feminism came up. So over time, what happened is it became a critical stance that decenters the assumptions of the mainstream in terms of center, which were often supposed to be men, and periphery, which were often supposed to be women. So again, the initial ideas of feminism, or the premises of feminism, actually brought with it an idea that decenters this assumption. So it was an assumption that there is this center periphery model, and at the center of this model are all men, and at the periphery of this model are all women. And so the initial ideas of feminism decentered this idea. So it challenged this center periphery idea as a false assumption, and at the same time it shifted the subject of analysis to women. So for the first time we see that the subject of analysis, where it is a woman who is the subject of analysis, for the first time is brought into focus, because earlier research, if you recall some of the previous lectures, it left out an understanding or a discussion of women as research subjects. And the questions around what is deemed marginal or peripheral. So how do we define the marginal, how do we define the peripheral? The questions around that emerged. So at this point we also have to note that when we say peripheral or marginal, it is not outside the boundary of a society. So it's very much part of the society, but then it is assumed that society was built on that model of the center periphery, and therefore the power negotiations that went on, in that both the center and the periphery had a role to play, of course an unequal role to play, but both were part of that power negotiation. So the question of how do we define the marginal, how do we define the peripheral, came up as a critical stance of feminism. So as you can see in this diagram, that it maps the gender sexuality field continuum, and the directions in which these various discussions went in. So we see the ideas of modernism and postmodernism being juxtaposed in this respect, and we see that the direction to which they can go strong or weak. So we see one of the first discussions for the initial ideas of feminism comes with centering the human. So it is a philosophical borrowing, and it shows that the idea of the human is introduced in the conversation of nature society conversation. So the human as a category in the respect of modernism evolved to be a very strong contribution, a very strong category that people started talking about human. Now as we transition from the modernism to the postmodernism, we see that several debates started to spring up. For example, the singular difference. For example, people now started to talk about the differences between humans, and the most immediate, the most evident of these differences, as we have seen, were in the form of the biological conditions of the human body. So based on that, we see that singular differences were drawn in order to offer explanations of people's experiences in society. The third addition to this came in the form of multiple differences, that people started to talk about these categories, again not just in terms of the biological conditions, not just in terms of gender differences, but also in terms of other axes of differences. For example, race, ethnicity, nationality, religion, education, etc. So we see that this was a third addition to this conversation. The fourth addition comes when we see discussions related to power, which is relational. So again, extending the conversation to the core periphery model of understanding, the theories of feminism, that we see the question of power comes up, that who is negotiating power with whom, and therefore power emerges as a relational category. Power emerges as a negotiation between these relations. Now, these conversations, these introductions of ideas, the second, third and fourth, in terms of difference, in terms of power, they showcased a kind of transition from modernism to postmodernism, but they were kind of in the middle of these two paradigms. We see a fifth idea being introduced, the idea of fluidity or instability, and this is one of the most strong conceptualizations or contributions of postmodernism, that we see that several of these ideas of gender, of race, of power, so all of these, even sexuality, all of these are actually fluid concepts. All of these are actually unstable in the sense that they're not static. They are not, their understanding is not static, and they are constantly in a process, constantly a work in progress. So this is more or less an understanding. This gives you an understanding of from where several of these concepts started their journey from one paradigm and made their way into the next paradigm. Continuum that you see, the map of modernism, postmodernism continuum in the case of feminism. The previous continuum showed you, as we talked about, the concepts that have contributed to the growth of feminism, and the next continuum, this one, shows particularly with respect to feminism, where and with respect to the paradigms of modernism and postmodernism, where each of the types of feminisms, or as they relate to any particular wave of feminism, how and where do they fit in. So the first type or a framework to understand feminism, the earliest form of understanding feminism, is how we understand emancipatory feminism, and this is one of the stronger elements of modernism, and we can talk about the liberal, the Marxist, the socialist and radical feminisms in this respect, where we see that again, for the first time, it is equated with the introduction of the human in the conversation. So we see that this actually can be the first wave of feminism in the late 18th and 19th centuries, and it was marked by its critique of dominant Western thinking of the time, which is usually the critique of liberalism. And this is one of the starting points to understand from where emancipatory feminism comes from. The second type, or the second theoretical direction of feminism, comes from the singular gender differences, or if you recall the previous continuum where we talked about the singular differences. If you take that to this continuum, then we see that we can fit in the radical socialist and the psychoanalytic feminisms in this context, and this one talked about the single differences, the single biological differences between people. The third concept in this regard is the social constructionist idea. Again, this one fits with the multiple differences that we talked about in the previous slide, and in the social constructionist approach, we see the birth of socialist feminisms, and around this time you also see that a question of identity construction comes up, although it was not fully explored. So how does one's identity is created? What is the role of identity in creation of the human? So all of that comes up around this time, but it's not really explored as much as it is in the next concept, which is the multiple differences. And multiple differences, of course, brings with them the idea of race, ethnicity, imperialism, feminisms, the idea that gender works along and across many of these differences. So when you talk about just one difference, it just leaves the story incomplete. It doesn't tell you the entire gender experience in this respect. So it is important for us to bring in these multiple axes of differences. And finally, in the fifth concept in this regard is the idea of the postmodern subject, and by this time we see that the question around identity, the question around what constructs identity, how identity evolves, does it evolve at all or not, can we think of identity as a process of identification. So all of those questions come up around this time of the postmodern, and how is the postmodern subject created. So who is a postmodern subject, how is a postmodern subject created, and what is the role of the postmodern subject in society. So so feminism, as you can see, is the umbrella term that brings with it all of these understanding of shifts in concepts over time and space in societies, as societies transition from one type or one level to another. And we see that each of these types of feminisms actually is characterized by certain events or phenomena. So if we have to summarize the frames of references and directions for feminism, we see that we can talk about the human emancipatory feminism, as we talked about in the previous two slides, that the idea of the human, the idea of the construction of the human, or the introduction, inclusion of the human in the conversation with social understanding. The second frame of reference in this regard is the single differences, as we have seen in the previous two slides, that is to talk about just one type of difference, or the sexual difference in this case. The third type of reference has been the multiple differences, and talking about race, ethnicity, etc., as we've seen in the previous slide. And then finally, the last two, particularly the fourth one, talks about relational power or social constructionism, and how is power generated, how is power negotiated, what is the framework to understand power. So power as a relational concept comes up in the fourth frame, and the fifth and the ongoing frame is the idea of postmodern feminism, which is adhering to ideas of fluidity, of instability, and the postmodern subject creation. So this in a way gives you an overall idea of what are the various frames, what are the various points of references that you can use to understand the growth and evolution of feminism, or feminisms over time, over space, and what are some of the key significant characteristics that actually characterize each of these frames of reference. So just to give you a little more understanding on emancipatory feminism, because that is one of the earliest and has been a premise of work for many of the future feminist theories, that as I say, that it started around the 18th and the 19th centuries as a critique of liberalism. And we see that later on in the 1960s, 1970s, the stronger criticism of the universal standard of liberalism actually took shape. And what happened later on is that the idea that power is owned by the dominant group, that is produced by the dominant group and is used to subordinate another group, that came under the focus, that came under a lot of conversations. And so these are some of the key characteristics that the earliest phases of feminism brought with it. The idea of the emancipatory feminism as a modernist idea belonging to that paradigm also showed us that there was a faith in meta narratives. So basically, this this form of feminism, the emancipatory feminism, talked about these large scale macro holistic accounts which were often explanatory, and which offers notions of a single central universal truth. So there was a lot of focus, a lot of meaning invested in a single central universal truth as a meta narrative, as a type of meta narrative. The second idea here, as power seen as domination downwards and as the property of the dominant, such that power can be used or power can be thrown off, and society can be made free of power. So that idea also belonged to the earliest ideas of feminism, the emancipatory feminism. And the third idea, the self as oppressed by social power, is conceptualizing the self as oppressed or repressed by social power, but having kind of an inner core that is beyond the operation of power, which can be emancipated, which can be liberated. So at this point scholars or thinkers or philosophers were thinking that power is probably something that that is a characteristic of an individual, but then a self can be made free from the exercise of power, and a self can be emancipated or liberated. So of course, each of these were criticized later on by the various waves of feminisms and other theorizations, but it just gives us a good starting point to understand that what were some of these questions that led to the rise of feminism or the waves of feminism. So we see, if we can quickly take a look at the waves of feminism, we see that in the 1830s, the main issues in the US, in the West, were abolition of slavery and women's and the non-existence of women's rights in social understanding. And in 1848, we see the Women's Rights Convention that was held in New York, that brought with it the question of women's rights and the conferring of women's rights. And the 1920, we see that the 19th Amendment guaranteed women the right to vote, and this is all in the US context, that where the first wave of feminism actually comes from. And one of the earliest works we see in this regard is by Mary Wollstonecraft, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which is regarded as the earliest and the foundation work of feminist movement. That around this time, the 1920s, people started to emerge, people started to become visible, and particularly talking about women's rights in society. And until 1920, they were guaranteed the right to vote. The second wave, which started around the 1960s, 1970s, saw that there was heightened feminist consciousness, and this movement was linked to the civil rights movement that began in the late 1950s. And some of the key ideas or key issues that the second wave addressed was anti-discrimination policies and equal privileges. So again, the second wave, in the context of the US, in the context of the so-called West, came with an emerging or a heightened feminist consciousness, and we see that some of the key issues that were addressed in the second wave were anti-discrimination policies. The questions of equal privileges, the question of gender equality comes with the second wave. And the third wave, takes this conversation a little beyond that, and it talks about inclusive frameworks. It talks about eclectic frameworks, and it of course pushes the conversation beyond thinking in terms of duality. So it is at this point that the core periphery model was already challenged, that men at the center, women at the margin, that's how society functions. That was already challenged in the first wave, and then people started to talk about difference, not just differences amongst men or amongst differences between men and women, but also differences amongst women and differences amongst men. And then after that, the conversation started to include that it is not just gender that operates to give a person its gender experience, but it operates along and across these other axes, and therefore the third wave proposed for an inclusive framework or a set of frameworks, and pushed the conversation beyond just thinking about the dualities, thinking about just the occurrence of either or, the binaries, the dualities. Okay, so with that understanding, we'll now take a look at some of the various types of feminisms that we see in scholarship and we see in society. So, starting with the idea of liberal feminism, which is one of the earliest forms of feminisms, as we talked about, that puts the idea of socialization as the origin of gender differences. That we have seen in the second lecture how we have unpacked the idea of the biological sex from gender, and then gender socialization goes a long way to perpetuate, to bring in these differences in society. And one of the goals of liberal feminism was gender justice, and we see some of the key works, some of the key scholars around this time. Mary Wollstonecraft we have talked about, John Stuart Mill and Harry Taylor Mill. Barry Frieden wrote The Feminine Mystique in 1963. So we see the increasing visibility of scholars more and more talking about the importance of pushing the conversation to beyond dualities. And of course, this idea is not free from criticism, just like most ideas in social theory, that the ways in which this theory assumed masculine and feminine were problematic to a large extent, and therefore that is one of the limitations of the liberal feminism framework. The second and the third type of feminism framework that we see is the Marxist feminism and the socialist feminism. So in Marxist feminism we see, of course, the idea of class. If you are familiar with the theory of Marx, you will see that class forms a core concept in Marxism, and in this case for Marxist feminism, class accounts for women's status and function in society. So everything gets described or interpreted in terms of class, and so class accounts for how much status would a woman have in society and function in society. We see that if we adopt the Marxist lens of feminism, that we it offers an understanding of how and why monogamous marriage is about private property. So it's about ownership. It's an economic lens that offers a class struggle, a class power dynamic, the question of private property ownership through marriage, and that is where the Marxist feminism comes from. And of course, the family is a microcosm of society's larger class relations, as Marxist feminists put forward, that it is primarily the unit of analysis in this case is the family, which forms as a microcosm for the larger class relations that we see in society. The framework of socialist feminism talks about the idea of class and gender as intersecting points. So it borrows from the idea of Marxism in the idea that it talks about class, but it also says that class and gender, class alone doesn't determine gender experiences, but gender and class intersect, and both patriarchy and capitalism must be analyzed as categories, as as social arrangements, social structures, to understand how class and gender intersect. The next theoretical perspective in this regard is radical feminism, which talks about the male power and privilege as viewed as basis of social relations, and this kind of takes us back to the core periphery model of feminism that we talked about, that we are talking about somebody or a category being at the center and a category being at the margin, and all of the power, all of the privilege is vested in the center, and therefore the periphery remains subordinated. So this is the starting point of radical feminism, and their goal is in the abolition of male supremacy. So the assumed understanding that there is a this is a supreme category and there is an inferior category, and the male is the supreme category and the female is the inferior category. So the radical feminism idea brings with it the idea to abolish this assumed hierarchy, and they propose focusing on establishing women-centered beliefs and systems. So again, moving the focus from an androcentric focus to focusing more on women as research subjects. Multiracial feminism talks about the intersections of race, class and gender, as we have briefly talked about previously, and it puts a question that how does the experience of domination shape the life experiences of people of color. And this is a type of feminism that was growing out of the history of the US, particularly the history of the African American movements, and people, scholars were more and more asking, since particular category of people are labeled as people of color, much of this understanding of their gender experiences comes from an intersection of all of these categories. So how does that experience of domination or subordination shape the life experiences of people of color, was what multiracial feminists were asking. And they were also asking the importance of human agency, that human beings as active and creative beings in society. So what sort of agency is endowed, what sort of agency is commanded by a human being in society, and how much of that agency is played out in respect to the overall structure, the social structures in society. So this is in a way what multiracial feminists introduced to the theoretical perspective of feminism. The next two types of feminisms look at more postmodern types, starting with the postmodern feminism, where women is assumed as a category of the other, and what are some of the advantages or disadvantages of the otherness. And at this point, we see the birth and the growth of the feminist standpoint theory, which suggests that the location of the knower shapes what is known. Not all perspectives are equally valid or complete. So, again, it brings with it the idea that it is important to know about the social location of a person, and a social location of a person shapes the knowledge, shapes the perspectives of that person in society, and not all perspectives are equally valid or complete. And so feminist standpoint theory makes a very significant contribution here in suggesting that a person's social location must be charted out. And queer theory talks about the idea that sexual identities are viewed as socially constructed. So queer theory is something that we will be talking about later on in this course when we will do normativity, subversions, and queer theory. But for now, just look at it as a type of theoretical perspective in feminist theory, where sexual identities are viewed as socially constructed. So even those identities are fluid, even those identities are constantly being negotiated. And it focuses on how sexual identity is performed and meanings are constructed. So it's not just negotiated, but it's also performed. So gender as a performance, and the various meanings, tangible or symbolic meanings that are constructed in this respect is what queer theory looks at. So we see that with that we also have an idea of the cultural feminism, and the cultural feminists talk about the fundamental differences between men and women, and these differences, particularly differences as focused on women, should be celebrated. And there is an attempt to recover lost or marginalized women's works and traditions and create a culture that nurtures and supports women's experiences, because historically, because societies functioned on an assumption that the core periphery model, there were a lot of work or voices that were lost because women as a category were marginalized, or women who were marginalized. So there was an attempt by cultural feminists to recover those lost voices, to recover those lost works, those lost traditions, and create a support system out of that to support women's experiences and celebrate around the world. So here again we go back to the idea of essentialism, where it is the belief system in the real true essence of things, and in this respect, when we talk of sexuality and gender is determined by an individual's biology or psychology, is again questioned. The idea of biological essentialism is questioned in this regard. And finally, we see that the journey that feminism started with the emancipatory idea of feminism, the human as a category, the human that is free from, the human that can be free from power dynamics, and the self can be liberated. The journey from there through time, through the various types of feminisms and perspectives that you just saw, to an idea of intersectionality, how we understand much of the gender relations today, is completely vested, completely informed by power relations, by power dynamics, and not just using gender as a variable. It uses several other of these axes of differences in relation with gender to understand the gender experiences. So we see around the 1990s, scholars started arguing that gender is not a property of an individual but is an emergent feature of social situations, and gender relations are processes involving power. So the idea that power is omnipresent, the power is present everywhere, and power percolates through the various strata, through people, and it navigates several of these experiences, or it determines several of these experiences, is something that is very obvious. The axis of identity, as I said, that inform gender relations relate to each other, and these are some of the key axis of identity of race, class, age, ethnicity, and that give birth to a very commonly, very often used framework of feminist studies, that is intersectionality studies. And power, age, social status, ethnicity all structure how gender related behaviors play out, and how they also vary in particular situations and historical periods. So these the experiences that is formed by these identity axes in relation to power, they vary across historical periods, they vary across situations, so they keep evolving, they keep changing over time and place. As I said at the start of the lecture, that we see the theories of gender, where we place feminism on one hand and masculinity studies as an emerging field currently, has been proposed as alternative feminisms by several scholars. And under this, we see a discussion on masculinity studies, and the idea of how the masculinity, the category of the masculine is created, and what can be some of the proposed theoretical angles that can be explored in this regard. So we see the emergence of an inclusive masculinity theory, which shifts in the social and cultural landscape, which addresses the shifts in these two landscapes, and it acknowledges that they have brought about the development of more inclusive and non-homophobic forms of masculinity. So the cultural and the social landscapes keep changing, and the emergence of a non-homophobic and more inclusive framework or an understanding of masculinity is a key element of inclusive masculinity theory. The decreasing levels of cultural homohysteria, that is the fear of being homosexualized, enable men to develop softer, more expressive and tactile forms of masculinity. So as we have seen that previously also, and we will see later on in the various lectures, that the idea of the heteronormativity, the idea of heterosexuality being the norm, and people trying to fit themselves in relation to that norm, in terms of their gender relations, that homohysteria, or the fear of being homosexualized, is decreasing, and which is enabling people to develop more or different types of expressions, different types of forms of masculinity, and therefore the idea of masculinity is again giving rise to multiple forms. So it's like multiple masculinities. And the existence of masculinity without hierarchy or hegemony. So there is an implicit understanding of power in this masculine, the inclusive masculinity theory, and how can we understand the categories of masculinity without talking about the hierarchy or hegemony. So is it possible, and if it is, then how does it pan out in society? So we see that over time there have been several of these descriptors that have been used to define males, such as machismo, macho, etc., and that those descriptors, those explanations are actually changing over time, this is bringing with it newer understandings of how we understand masculinity, just like newer understandings of femininity. And masculinity, defined in terms of gender display or gender expression, forms a characteristic feature of the inclusive masculinity theory. However, scholars have criticized this proposition, this framework, as ignoring the structural position of power and privilege. So the discussion goes back to the idea that can we talk about gender relations, can we talk about these multiple masculinities without talking about the structural position of power and privilege? Is it possible? And that has been one of the major criticisms leveled against inclusive masculinity theory. So over time, we have seen that the idea of feminism, the idea of masculinity studies have gone through various paradigms, and they have gone through, as we have seen at the start of this lecture, feminism has gone through the paradigm of modernism into postmodernism, and the various shifts in the conceptualization of feminism in this regard. Now, we have also seen that much of these conversations, much of these theoretical formulations have been around the construction of people's identity. So how does one's gender identity gets constructed? What is at play? How much role does power have in this regard to construct that identity? So all of that has been around an idea of construction of an identity. Now, in this regard, something that is very important for us to understand is this one concept, this one parameter that has been used in scholarship over and over again that influences identity, and that parameter is language. And we have seen that over time, looking at the shifts in the paradigms to understand language, we can identify two broad paradigms, which is known as structuralism and post-structuralism. So these are the two broad paradigms in terms of speaking about language and identity construction, and that becomes important in this regard to understand how have the various theories of feminisms emerged and developed over time. So we see that the idea of structuralism and post-structuralism relate to the idea of language, and the specific commitment to the idea that language is necessarily the central consideration in all attempts to know, act and live. So language is at the is one of these significant factors contributing to the development of identity. And so what has been some of the journey of structuralism and post-structuralism in this regard. So in structuralism, we see that this is a paradigm that signifies practices that generate meaning as an outcome of structures or predictable regularities. And when we say that we need a structuralist understanding of culture, it is concerned with the systems of relations. So it is practically impossible to talk about culture and a structural understanding of culture without paying attention to the systems of relations that comprise it. So this idea of structuralism developed as a theoretical framework in linguistics in the late 1920s and around the early 1930s, and it was proposed that languages were constructed of hidden rules that practitioners know but are unable to articulate. So knowing a language and articulating a language, both are guided by some rules, and some of these were explored by the proponents of structuralism. Now post-structuralism in this case looks at what happens after the paradigm of structuralism, but also offers a critique to the understanding of post-structuralism. And post-structuralism decenters. Now, post-structuralism comes in as a not just as a paradigm after structuralism, but also as a critique to structuralism. Now, in structuralism, we see that this subject is decentered. So, the system of signs and significations are, more emphasized, and there is a concentration on a ahistorical, idea of social system. So, history is not really put in context in structuralism, but in post-structuralist theory, we see that there's a problematization of reliability or stability of meaning, and places language in a place where it slides between the signifier, signified, and the referent. So you see that the post-structuralist idea brings with it a complete destabilizing of how structuralism functioned, that looking at social relations or social systems of signs and signification, but not really paying enough attention to or attention at all to historical processes. And so post-structuralism comes in and problematizes these stability of meanings, and says that there's a constant evolution of these ideas. So it is also articulated by a speaking subject located in society in post-structuralist debates, that proposes that language be considered as one system in relation to the other system, and always is one articulated by a speaking subject located in society. So, language more accurately conceived as language in use, rather than a fixed structure or system. And you will see, if you reflect back on this idea, that language shifts in society, and the way that people talk, the way that people articulate, the way that people relate to each other in terms of language shifts over time. And it is important therefore to acknowledge what is the language in use. So rather than saying that this is the language that has been carried on forever, making it ahistorical. And with that, we come to the understanding of discourse, in this regard, which informed much of the feminist theorizing, that how do we understand language as being linked to subjective social processes as opposed to closed or immutable states. So what is the role of discourse in this regard, and how are discourses actually formed to inflect social and ideological environments? So we see at the bottom of all of this discussion of the growth of the various forms of feminisms over time, and as you've seen in the structuralist, post-structuralist idea debate, that power has been an omnipresent idea, that power, the role of power cannot be undermined. So the questions in this regard is that, is power exercised, not possessed? Is the question that is it an attribute of an individual, or is it not is it exercised through the individual, or is it possessed by the individual? It flows through the society and can be productive, not just repressive. So power has the power to actually be productive and not just repressive in all respects. And we see that there is a lot of discussion about power in particularly in Foucault's work in the history of sexuality, where he has talked about how power manifests as resistance, or it reforms several of these relations. So at this point, I want to leave you with a question to reflect on, with regard to agency and structure, how much of individuality can we express before the structures of society restrict our expression. And if you are interested for further reading, please read up Chris Beasley's work on gender and sexuality. And in the next lecture, I will take up the issues around gender in post-colonial studies. Thank you.